This is not an ordinary isekai story, nor a story in which a party fired a hero and he becomes strongest. This is a masterpiece in which the Demon King's daughter comes to Earth in the search of love, and find our protagonist, who is a normal school teacher. When our protagonist gets to know that if she ever cried, Demon King will destroy the whole planet, he was left speechless. So the story starts with I2 standing paralyzed by the gravity of the situation. Cruel checkmate with no escape. If he chose yes, death awaited him. If he chose no, the world would fall into ruin. Either choice led to despair. 10 years had passed since the first gate opened, linking their world to countless others. These other worlds often mirrored tales of fantasy, where heroes triumphed over demons. But every time a reincarnate returned, more gates appeared. The phenomenon became so frequent that otherworlders were no longer extraordinary, they had integrated into society, some even living mundane lives. For Ituyu, however, other worlds mattered less than the struggles of his own. As a teacher, his focus was firmly on his work and his students. That day, a young girl from his class nervously asked to speak with him in private. Out of earshot, she confessed her feelings for him, stammering but determined. Itu blinked in disbelief. This was the third confession he'd received this month. Suppressing a sigh, he carefully began his rejection. Though the idea of being confessed to might flatter any man, Itu couldn't share that sentiment. He was a plain, middle-aged teacher of average build with an unremarkable salary to match. The truth was painfully simple: he was popular only because he taught at an all-girls boarding school, where he was the sole male figure. To these teenage girls, he was an exotic option. In the real world, however, he doubted anyone would spare him a second glance. Gently, he apologized and advised her to focus on such matters after growing up. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she ran off sobbing, leaving Itu standing awkwardly. He muttered to himself, wishing for a peaceful teaching career. Humoring any of these confessions, he knew, would only end in disaster. Later, as he walked through the school corridors, the principal, a kindly older woman, stopped him. With a warm smile, she informed him that a transfer student would be joining his class the next day. Her tone carried an odd note, as if she were subtly warning him to prepare himself. Puzzled but too tired to dwell on it, Itu nodded and went on with his day. The following morning, he stood before his class, announcing the arrival of a new student. The girls erupted with excitement, their chatter filling the room as they speculated about the newcomer. Smiling faintly, Itu thought to himself how much easier life would be if the transfer student were just a normal human. But the moment the new student walked in, the air grew heavy. A girl with horns entered, her confident voice cutting through the silence as she introduced herself: Lumis, daughter of the infamous demon Lord Lumian. The class froze. The demon Lord Lumian was a name spoken in fear, a tyrant whose power was known across worlds. Many brave reincarnates had challenged her, only to perish. For a moment, Itu prepared himself to shield his students from this terrifying newcomer. Yet, to his surprise, the girls quickly swarmed Lumis, showering her with curiosity and enthusiasm. They fawned over her horns and peppered her with questions. Itu stood dumbfounded by their rapid acceptance, eventually clearing his throat and urging them to settle down so homeroom could begin. That evening, Itu called Lumis to the night duty room, which served as his modest living quarters. Feeling the weight of responsibility, he cautiously explained that she was the first otherworlder he'd ever taught. He encouraged her to let him know if she had any concerns or needed assistance. Lumis smiled mischievously, joking that if anything happened to her, her mother would have his head. Her tone shifted, however, as she gazed at him with a wistful expression. Lumis confided that she'd begged her mother for permission to study in this world. Her reason? She wanted to experience something she'd only read about in books: falling in love. Itu stared, unsure how to respond, until she pulled out a well-worn manga volume and placed it in his hands. He immediately recognized it as a popular romance series recently adapted into a drama. When he began to dismiss it as silly, Lumis leaned in, her sharp eyes narrowing. He froze as her face drew closer, her horns almost brushing his hair. Care to repeat that? She challenged, her voice low and dangerous. Panicking, Itu quickly backtracked, claiming he'd only heard others' opinions and personally enjoyed the series. Satisfied, Lumis backed away, a playful grin replacing her earlier menace. As she flipped through the manga, chattering excitedly, Itu could only sigh, wondering what kind of chaos awaited him next. The mysterious daughter of the demon lord, Lumis, clutched the book tightly to her chest, her face lighting up with excitement. "It's perfect. A masterpiece," she declared, her voice filled with longing. She murmured about wishing for a romance as magical as the one in the story. Kazuki Itu, her homeroom teacher, couldn't help but recall a detail he'd once heard: romance was a foreign concept in Overly Luge, her homeland where arranged marriages were the norm. For Lumis, love wasn't just a dream, it was a forbidden treasure. Kazuki's interest in such matters was minimal at best, but the thought of a young girl being denied something so fundamental tugged at his heart. Flashing her a reassuring smile, he promised to help however he could. Overjoyed, Lumis placed her trust in him, eager to have someone by her side. As their conversation ended, Kazuki hesitated to correct the way she addressed him, but eventually decided it wasn't worth the effort. Left alone to finish his dinner, he found himself reflecting on the concerns he'd had when informed about her arrival. Suddenly, a presence startled him. A shadow moved silently behind him, and before he could react, a cold blade pressed lightly against his neck. "Don't move," a woman's voice whispered sharply. Kazuki froze, his heart pounding. The stranger, clad in a sleek black uniform, removed the knife but kept her piercing gaze locked on him. "Name Satu?" "I'm with the Interdimensional Containment Unit," she said curtly. "I need your cooperation." Still reeling from shock, Kazuki could only stammer, What?" Cooperation for what Satu sighed, as if used to this reaction, and began her explanation. 10 years ago, humanity's contact with beings from other worlds had escalated, bringing with it both opportunities and dangers. Magic, once a fantastical concept, had become a reality that often exceeded human understanding. Satu's division existed to manage the unpredictable fallout of these interactions. Kazuki nodded along, still unsure how any of this related to him. Then Satu dropped the bombshell, "The fate of Earth hinges on you." According to Satu, Lumis wasn't just any student, she was the beloved daughter of Lumians, the demon lord of Overlelouch. When Lumians allowed her daughter to study abroad, she made a terrifying proclamation: if anything were to make Lumis cry, Earth would face annihilation. The declaration wasn't an empty threat. Lumians had already crushed countless challengers, her power unmatched. A stubbed toe, a fight with a friend, or even the death of a pet could spell the end of the world. Kazuki struggled to process the weight of this revelation. "Why not just assign her a bodyguard?" he asked weakly. Satu rolled her eyes. "She despises being treated differently. Even my presence has to remain a secret. And frankly, our department's budget is laughable. We're barely scraping by." Satu leaned in, her tone serious. "As her homeroom teacher, you're the closest human to her. For the next year, until she graduates and returns to her world, it's your job to make sure she doesn't shed a single tear." Before Kazuki could argue, Satu gripped his shoulder firmly. "This is confidential. Don't mess it up," she said before vanishing as abruptly as she'd appeared. The next day, Kazuki found himself distracted during gym class, keeping a wary eye on Lumis as the students played volleyball. His nerves spiked when the ball accidentally struck her square in the face. The class fell silent, watching nervously as Lumis trembled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Kazuki braced himself for the worst, but to his relief, she forced a smile and declared, "That didn't hurt at all." The students quickly apologized, and the game resumed. However, another problem arose when Lumis was told to serve the ball. She had no idea how, so Kazuki gave her a quick explanation, adding that beginners often couldn't get the ball over the net. Determined to succeed, Lumis nodded and then imbued the ball with a frightening amount of magic. Grinning confidently, she called out, "Watch this!" Kazuki's stomach dropped as he realized the impending disaster. "Wait, stop!" he shouted, but it was too late. Lumis launched the ball with all her might, sending it hurtling toward the net like a blazing comet. The moment Lumis leapt into the air, her hand connected with the ball in a dazzling flash of energy. The force shattered the gym wall, leaving a massive hole and scattering debris. Students cowered, some trembling on the floor, narrowly avoiding the magical projectile that rocketed through the air. Lumis, unfazed, stood proudly with a triumphant grin. "How many points was that?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. One brave student stammered, "It doesn't work like that." Meanwhile, Kazuki Itu buried his face in his hands, wondering how on earth he was going to explain the massive damage to school property. Later, as he wandered the corridors, Kazuki sighed, exhaustion etched on his face. He hadn't anticipated the demon princess's power to be so overwhelming. Lost in thought about how to handle the situation, he was interrupted by two students who approached him urgently. "Sensei, we need to talk," one of them began. "What's wrong?" he asked, bracing himself. The girls hesitated before explaining, "The class has been talking about what happened in the gym yesterday. We've decided it's best to request Lumis transfer, as soon as possible." Kazuki froze. While the news saddened him, he couldn't entirely blame them. Witnessing such a terrifying display of power would rattle anyone. Then, a realization struck him like lightning. The entire class talked about this, without her. The girls nodded. "We thought it'd be better to keep it from her for now." Kazuki's stomach sank. Without another word, he bolted down the hall, leaving the girls behind in confusion. He burst into the classroom, his heart pounding. "Lumis, we need to." He stopped in his tracks. The scene before him confirmed his worst fears. Lumis sat alone, isolated from her peers, her shoulders slumped as the rest of the class kept their distance. The telltale shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes sent alarm bells ringing in Kazuki's head. Earth's fate was hanging by a thread. Before he could act, Lumis stood, her voice trembling yet resolute. "Everyone, please listen to me," she began, forcing a brave smile. I've lived in another world my entire life. I don't understand how things work here, and I went too far trying to show you how strong I am. It seems I've only scared you." The class murmured quietly, some nodding hesitantly. Lumis took a deep breath, her voice cracking as she continued. "I'm sorry for causing so much trouble. I'll return to my world right away." Her words caused mixed reactions, some relief, some guilt. Kazuki, however, was silent, frozen in place. Anger swelled within him, not at the students, but at himself. He had been so preoccupied with the mission, with preventing the Earth's destruction, that he'd forgotten one crucial thing. Lumis was just a 17-year-old girl. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Wait, Lumis, you don't need to go anywhere." The room fell silent as he turned to the class. "What happened yesterday wasn't her fault, it was mine. I told her to give it her all when serving the ball. If anyone's to blame, it's me." Lumis looked up at him, surprised. But more importantly, Kazuki continued, addressing the students. "She's your classmate. She's not some monster to be feared. Look." He held out his hand to Lumis. "Shake my hand, gently this time." Lumis hesitated before placing her hand in his, careful to control her strength. Kazuki turned back to the class, raising their clasped hands. "See? She's not dangerous. She's just like you, a student who wants to fit in." The tension in the room began to dissolve. Some students exchanged guilty looks, while others nodded in agreement. Kazuki took it a step further, pulling Lumis into a quick, awkward hug. Her face turned bright red, and the class erupted in murmurs. "You don't need to treat her differently," he said firmly. "Just talk to her, laugh with her, and treat her like any other classmate." Slowly but surely, the ice broke. One by one, students approached Lumis, apologizing and asking to start over. Her face lit up as she realized they truly wanted to get along. As the class rallied around her, Lumis turned to Kazuki, her usual pride returning. "Well, if you're all so insistent, I guess I'll stay." Kazuki sighed in relief, finally feeling like the crisis had passed. But as the students began chatting and laughing, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of his mind. Little did he know, the real challenges were just beginning. A week had passed since Lumis transferred to the school, and she quickly became the center of attention. The students eagerly surrounded her, urging her to repeat herself. Flustered by their energy, she looked away and admitted, with a hint of bashfulness, that she had been feeling a bit off lately. Her heart raced every time she saw A2, and her cheeks warmed in his presence. Perplexed, she wondered if he had somehow cursed her. Her classmates, however, had a different take. One girl hugged her tightly and whispered confidently that it was love. Lumis dismissed the notion, but her classmates rallied around her. Encouragement poured in from every direction, urging her to confess. Hesitant but persuaded, she decided to give it a try. Unbeknownst to them, the entire exchange was overheard by their instructor, E2. Though flattered by the idea of being admired by a student, he immediately dismissed the possibility. Their teacher-student relationship made such feelings inappropriate, and he resolved to turn her down. But as he considered the situation, his stomach churned with dread. Satu, his colleague, pointed out that rejecting Lumis might not end well. "Teenage girls were prone to tears after rejection," she said, but Lumis was no ordinary girl. Her tears could spell disaster. If the world were to crumble over a failed confession, A2's options grew even bleaker. Even if he agreed to date her, a future breakup would bring the wrath of Lumian, her mother, leaving marriage as the only solution. That thought alone made him shudder. Then came the revelation that froze him in place. Satu casually reminded him of Overluge's royal customs. If Lumis bore a child, her husband would be consumed literally. A2 recoiled at the thought, likening it to a praying mantis devouring its mate. This was no metaphor, it was tradition. Accepting her confession, then, was tantamount to signing his death warrant. His choices boiled down to his own death or the potential destruction of the world. Satu, unfazed, asked if he was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for humanity. A2 panicked, begging for his life and chastising her for treating such a grim situation so lightly. Running away was out of the question. Lumis' tears alone could trigger calamity. Desperate, he suggested relocating everyone to another world, but Satu shot the idea down, warning that Lumian would hunt him relentlessly. Cornered, E2 scrambled for a solution. His eyes landed on a romance novel Lumis had been reading. A spark of hope ignited. Flipping through its pages, he pieced together a plan. Calling Satu, he explained his idea and enlisted her help. The next day, Lumis shyly approached him in class and invited him to watch a movie. I2 knew this was her chance to confess, and rejecting the invitation outright wouldn't stop her. He accepted, under the guise of introducing her to human culture. At the cinema, A2 waited nervously. Lumis arrived, dressed with her friend's help, and asked if her outfit suited her. A2, unable to deny how stunning she looked, called her cute, sending her into a flustered, crimson-cheeked state. She quickly composed herself and led the way to the ticket counter. Browsing the film options, Lumis gravitated toward Titanic. A2 firmly rejected the idea, unwilling to endure her inevitable tears. She then pointed to a horror movie, and he agreed, thinking it the safer choice. At least with this, he could avoid the danger of her crying, and, perhaps, find a way to survive the impossible situation he was in. He is taken aback as the screen is flooded with disturbing, grotesque images. The daughter of the notorious demon lord, who he thought would be unfazed, is instead visibly shaken, on the verge of tears. She keeps pleading, asking if such cruel acts are permissible, her voice filled with panic, until someone tells her to quiet down. Terrified, she clings to him, trembling. He feels uneasy as the proximity between them becomes uncomfortable, prompting him to distance himself. Slowly, they both manage to endure the rest of the movie. Afterwards, Lumis joyfully enjoys a cake, her eyes lighting up with each bite. She exclaims in wonder, never having tasted something so delicious. Pleased by her reaction, A2 offers her his share, claiming he's had enough for the day. Despite being the Demon Lord's daughter, she's simply a teenager who enjoys sweets and fears horror films. They continue their date, spending the day wandering around the mall, indulging in fun activities. As the day ends and night sets in, Lumis excitedly expresses her desire to go on daily dates, now fully appreciating how enjoyable they can be. Turning to him, she asks if he had as much fun. After a brief pause, he admits he did, though he can't help but wonder how things could have been without his constant concern for the world. Lumis smiles, happy to share a mutual understanding. As she walks ahead, a bashful look crosses her face, and A2, sensing what's to come, realizes she's about to confess. She calls him over, saying she has something she can't share at school, and that's when it hits him she's going to confess her feelings. She tells him about a volleyball practice mishap, how she felt out of place, and how much his help meant to her. She repeats how much that moment made her happy, and as her feelings deepened, she couldn't ignore them any longer. A2, meanwhile, secretly sends messages on his phone, trying to manage the situation. As she hesitates, finally gathering the courage to speak, fireworks explode in the distance, drowning out her words. He asks her to repeat herself, but again the fireworks go off, masking her confession. Turning his attention to the sky, he exclaims in awe, asking her to say it once more. Feeling unsure, Lumis instead simply expresses her gratitude, inviting him to head back. The surrounding crowd admires the fireworks, wondering about the festival, while I2 checks his phone, relieved to have navigated the moment. Meanwhile, Satu, exhausted from her mission, curses the teacher for dragging her into his plan. She had been tasked with setting off fireworks after reading a girl's book, all to keep the teacher's ignorance intact. Despite doubts about the plan's success, there were no other options. She grumbles about the difficulty, cost, and illegality of launching unauthorized fireworks alone, but admits it was a small price to pay to save the world. The next morning, Lumis enters class, greeting everyone cheerfully. Her friends eagerly approach, wanting to know about her night. She shrugs, claiming it was just a typical date, leaving them skeptical. Class continues as usual, unaware that, even though the Earth was saved, things have become more complicated for the two adults involved. Lumis casually greets her teacher, calling him by his name, and her classmates can't help but gossip. They crowd around her, disregarding the teacher's requests, eager to know how far the two have gone. The sun rises on a new day, and A2's alarm blares loudly, but he struggles to get out of bed. With an important staff meeting ahead, he's still drained from yesterday's date. As a hero trying to save the world, he feels he deserves more rest. Suddenly, his room bursts open, and to his shock, Lumis is sitting on top of him, cheerfully greeting him good morning and insisting it's time to get up. Stunned, he asks why she's in his room first thing. She responds by telling him to stop complaining and be grateful, reminding him that he's notorious for always being late to class. He mutters under his breath about the Demon Lord's daughter, the last person he wanted to deal with at this hour. Lumis, originally a transfer student from another world, has adjusted well to her new life, though there were initial struggles. The real issue, however, is her mother, the powerful Demon Lord Lumianese, who swore to destroy the world if her daughter ever shed a tear. A2's main role as her homeroom teacher is to ensure that doesn't happen. Watching Lumis, he notices an odd expression on her face and asks what's wrong. She shyly admits there's nothing wrong, but now that they're alone, she feels embarrassed. She starts to recall the events of the previous night, but as her face turns red, E2 realizes what's about to happen. In Lumis' world, a woman devours her husband upon pregnancy, meaning a proposal or confession leads to death. He knows that if she confesses, he'll either die by accepting or rejecting her, with the world at risk if he refuses. Cornered, he panics as she starts speaking, knowing he's about to face an unavoidable confession. Mid-sentence, he abruptly rips his shirt off, making Lumis scream in shock. She protests, telling him to get dressed quickly, covering her eyes, and stepping outside. Once the door closes, he collapses to the floor, his heart racing. He hadn't anticipated a second confession attempt, thinking that her feelings would fade after the first. He resolves to do everything in his power to avoid another confession and protect both himself and the world. The class begins and he starts calling attendance, but while doing so, he notices Lumis staring at him, her face flushed, even during something as mundane as roll call. When he calls her name, she's so lost in thought that she doesn't respond, prompting him to raise his voice and snap her out of it. Embarrassed, she stands up quickly, asking why he called her. As he reprimands her for spacing out, her friends tease her, asking if she stayed up all night. She admits to it, explaining that she had been reading manga. E2 is sure, though, that she had been preparing for another confession. With that in mind, he steels himself for the inevitable. The first period is physical education, and A2 instructs the class to get dressed quickly. Some of the students complain about having to use the changing rooms, wishing they could change in their classrooms like some other classes. Some even joke that it's no big deal since they don't see him as a man anyway. Scolded, they head to the changing room, mocking him as they go. While his friends envy him being the only guy at the all-girls school, I2 knows it's not as easy as it sounds. He has to stay focused to avoid temptations and keep his job intact. After the other girls leave, Lumis remains by the door, hesitating as she watches him. He notices her, and after a moment of uncomfortable silence, asks what's wrong, reminding her that she'll be late for class. Finally meeting his gaze, she quietly says they're alone in the room, and he suddenly realizes what's happening. His heart races as he realizes she's about to confess in the middle of class. Trapped in a horrible situation, he tries to think of a way to avoid it. He considers repeating the earlier tactic, changing in front of her since it's PE class, but it's already too late. She grabs his hands, pushes him against the window, and tells him to listen carefully. Her body is far too close, and he can only look down into her tearfully sincere eyes as she begins to speak. A storm of thoughts fills his mind as he desperately searches for a way to escape this moment. Lumis blurts out her confession, but A2 doesn't respond. His eyes are fixed on the window, his mind racing as he concludes that there's no other option. He's resigned to it. Closing her eyes, Lumis waits for a reply. But when she opens them, she finds herself alone in the room. Confused, she peers out the window and is shocked to see A2 unconscious on the ground below after apparently jumping from the third floor. Meanwhile, A2 is regrouping with Satu in the male lounge. Satu praises him for his quick thinking, but warns him that he can't keep doing this. After the last stunt left him with broken limbs, his luck won't hold out much longer. I2 scoffs, but Satu is unfazed, insisting that a few injuries are worth it if the alternative is death. They shift focus to the future. A2 confesses that he thought he could handle Lumis' confessions, but she's been relentless, confessing at the most inconvenient times. There's no time to prepare, and with each encounter, his options are running thin. He turns to Satu, asking for advice on how to handle the situation next time. Satu, as dry as ever, casually suggests that he jump from the window again. A2, irritated, reminds her that the fate of the Earth is at stake. Satu covers his mouth, her expression serious, and whispers that Lumis is coming. Without hesitation, she leads him through a secret door, wishing him well. I2 is still processing the hidden door when Lumis unexpectedly enters the room, calling out to him softly. He freezes, unsure how to react. He plays it cool, trying to cover up his panic by claiming his injuries are just aching. Lumis blames herself for what happened and hands him a fruit basket, her voice tinged with guilt. But as she does, A2's heart sinks. They're alone again, and with his injuries, there's nowhere to run. A confession now would mean the end of everything. He can't afford that. Lumis recalls how he hadn't moved for a while after falling, and her worry grows. She expresses how terrified she was, thinking he had died, her hands trembling as tears begin to form in her eyes. She begs him to stay alive. Her vulnerability hits A2 hard. If she cries, he knows the world is in danger, but something inside him moves him more than the thought of saving the Earth. Despite his injured leg, he stands up, his resolve solidifying. He walks over to her and pulls her into a tight hug. She's surprised, but he reassures her with a calm voice, telling her that a teacher should never make his students cry. He promises that he won't die, that he'll stay with her until she graduates, and that she doesn't have to worry. He whispers again, this time to himself as much as to her, I won't die. I'll keep the Earth safe. Before they can fully process the moment, a group of female students bursts into the room, having heard that their teacher had fallen. They interrupt the intimate scene, pulling A2 and Lumis back into the reality of their chaotic lives. Lumis walks toward Kazuki, embarrassed but determined in a daring outfit. Kazuki, still trying to maintain composure, assures her that everything is fine and that he's ready to give in. With his permission, she lunges at him, bares her fangs, and digs her nails into his skin, thanking him for the food. But before anything can escalate, Kazuki jolts awake, his heart pounding in fear from the nightmare he just had. He's haunted by the thought of the Overlelouch family's brutal tradition of eating their husbands when they conceive. He breathes deeply, reminding himself to stay calm. He'll avoid that fate as long as he can steer clear of Lumis' confessions. To his shock, Satu whispers in his ear, asking if he had a good dream. Kazuki, startled, retreats into bed in disbelief, scolding Satu for coming into his room uninvited. She, however, seems unfazed, proudly boasting that she's great at picking locks, which only annoys Kazuki further. Once Kazuki has calmed down, they sit down to talk. But Satu's expression is serious, and she tells him that they are in a state of emergency. Kazuki, confused, asks what she means. She motions for him to listen to a voice recording on her phone, which reveals that she had secretly placed a recorder in his classroom. As the recording plays, they hear Lumis talking to her classmates about her struggles with confessing. She confesses how difficult it's been, and her classmates, hearing that she's failed so many times, try to cheer her up. One girl, Noriko, offers to teach her the secrets of a successful confession, though the others suspect that she got her advice from manga and dramas. Lumis, desperate, begs Noriko to share her knowledge. Noriko confidently claims that as a woman, she can use her body as a weapon against Kazuki, since men easily fall for it. The other girls are surprised, clearly skeptical, and Lumis stands there, clueless. Noriko, with a smug grin, reveals that she once kissed a boy on the cheek when she was 5, which makes the other girls relieved. Lumis, inspired by Noriko's wisdom, decides that she'll use the ultimate weapon of a woman to win Kazuki over. Kazuki listens, stunned, as the recording ends. He's surprised that Lumis's plan is just to kiss him. Satu, however, warns him that it's not that simple. He can't just avoid her kiss, because if Lumis kisses him, whether by her own initiative or by accident her mother, the great demon Lumians will come for him. Kazuki's heart sinks as he realizes the gravity of the situation. Lumianis, with her immense power, could erase his existence with a snap of her fingers for simply kissing her daughter. The thought terrifies him. Kazuki pleads with Satu to come up with a plan to avoid this disaster. He insists that they need to come up with another strategy, something like the fireworks plan they used before. Satu, however, calmly drinks her tea and dismisses the idea, saying they can't afford anything as extravagant as the fireworks display again. Kazuki, frustrated, argues that the world's safety should take priority over money. But then, it hits him. They don't need anything elaborate or expensive. They can use the school's announcement system to interrupt Lumis's plan, just like they did with the fireworks. All they need to do is crank up the volume and play a random announcement. Satu, initially skeptical, realizes that this simple plan could work just as effectively, and best of all, it's free. The two of them laugh, relieved to have found a solution, confident that they can avoid the disaster with ease. However, they've underestimated their opponent. They failed to consider the possibility that their plan might lead to an even worse outcome than they imagined. Kazuki was busy working on school papers when the headmistress approached him with urgent news. She informed him of an intruder who had been spotted around the school lately, and it seemed to be a serious threat to the students. As the only male teacher in the school, they expected him to take action. Kazuki, though perplexed, promised to do his best. The headmistress explained that the intruder was a woman, based on her features. When asked for more details, she described the woman wearing a black suit with long, tied-up hair. Kazuki froze, realizing the intruder was none other than Satu. Later, Kazuki made an announcement to his class, warning them about the intruder and advising everyone to be cautious. He also distributed alarms to the girls, simple devices that, when pressed, would emit a loud, blaring sound to alert others. As he handed out the alarms, Kazuki realized he could use them to prevent Lumis's potential confession. However, there was no alarm for himself. When he reached Lumis, she declined the alarm, saying she already had her own hideous-looking device that her mother had given her. She proudly called it destruction, explaining that pressing the button would subject the intruder to excruciating pain. Kazuki was troubled by this, worried that Satu might get hurt in the process. He insisted that Lumis take the alarm for her safety, causing her to blush and leaving the entire class cheering and squealing with delight. Later, during gym class, Kazuki couldn't help but wonder when Lumis would make her move. He was determined to ensure she wouldn't cry and bring about the world's destruction. While watching her play ball, he realized he should have banned her from sports altogether. Lumis, after being hit in the face with the ball, pretended it didn't hurt, refusing to admit she was bad at sports. Proudly, she claimed that she just lacked practice but was otherwise active. Kazuki told her to fetch the ball, and she ran after it, but as she did, 2 students from another class began gossiping about her. They made cruel comments about her horns, calling her a monster. Kazuki, overhearing the conversation, intervened, lecturing the girls about the harm and spreading negativity about a classmate. Lumis's classmates, trying to cheer her up, reminded her not to listen to students from class 1. One student, however, went further, accusing Lumis of being a threat to everyone after she created a large hole in the school wall. She was called a monster, and the cruel words left Lumis devastated. Tears welled up in her eyes as she ran off, away from the group. Kazuki instructed the sports committee leader to continue with the class while he went after Lumis. He found her hiding in the locker room, clearly upset. Kazuki hesitated, aware that if he were caught in the girls' changing room, he would be fired on the spot. He looked around, disgusted by the mess, before hearing Lumis's voice. She turned to him with a hurt expression, asking if she was truly a monster. Kazuki sighed and sat next to her, assuring her that he would report the students from class 1 for their behavior. He reassured her that she shouldn't worry about what others thought, because her classmates loved her for who she was. He pointed out that anyone who got to know her wouldn't be scared of her, they would love her instead. Lumis was quiet for a while, then looked at him with a quivering lip, asking, "Do you like me as well?" Kazuki smiled, sighing and saying that of course he liked her because she was one of his precious students. Her face lit up with a smile, and she blushed deeply, her heart racing for her teacher. Kazuki suggested they return to the class, but it was already too late. The students had entered the locker room to change. They were discussing how awful the students from class 1 were, when Chiori suddenly mentioned someone being in the locker room. The girls admonished Chiori for scaring them, and Kazuki, now sweating bullets inside the locker, realized he was in a dire situation. Lumis was dangerously close to him, and his heart pounded in panic. In a hushed voice, Kazuki asked Lumis why she had pulled him into the locker. She explained that she was worried he might get in trouble if caught and had hidden him to protect him. Kazuki realized their situation was even worse and suggested they leave and explain everything, But it was already too late. The girls had started changing and Kazuki knew they couldn't make a sound. He told Lumis to stay quiet until the girls left, or it would be the end for him. As he tried to calm himself and focus on surviving the ordeal, he turned to Lumis, only to find her leaning in closer. Before he could react, she was cornering him, leaving him at her mercy as she leaned in for a kiss. Kazuki's heart races as he grapples with the dilemma of the moment. He's trapped, inside a cramped locker with no way out, and Lumis is now dangerously close, her emotions on the brink of spilling over.